Hello friends, my name is Brian, and this is a 97 Toyota 4Runner. So my neighbor was going to throw this thing away, and he lost the title, so he gave it to me. And it's got this 2.7 liter engine, a super rare, underpowered, slow runner. So I checked the compression on it, and it was 150 out of 180. So essentially the motor is pretty tired. Quick glance underneath, it's the Exxon Valdez. So I started off on a head gasket job, and the guy put block sealer in it, so we're going to cover that drama story. And I found a scored up piston wall, so that means I got to replace the pistons and the rings. So essentially I'm going to cover all the drama of buying a low miles Facebook motor, help you restore your classic Toyota and keep it out of the junkyard, cover common failure points, and basically give you the beginner's guide and all the techniques and fail points and stuff that I struggled on during a full engine restore. 20-year-old car means 20-year-old rubber, so be careful with the intake charge pipes because they like to rip. I like to start over on the exhaust manifold because it's pretty simple. 3 bolts holding up the down pipe, and then we're going to basically play seesaw with the jack to get the easiest position. So I highly recommend going to Harbor Freight and getting the more expensive high-lift Daytona jacks. If you have this extra pipe going into your exhaust, it's called the EGR, and you always want to start with these first because they can turn into an absolute battlefield. Essentially, Toyota makes stuff super friendly, so we have E-Torx. You can remove the exhaust studs from the exhaust manifold to make your life pretty darn easy. So typically 4Runners have the 3.4 liter engine, and this one is the 4-cylinder, so the exhaust manifold's pretty simple. The 3.4 liter, not so simple. Start making a parts list, because I got a bunch of studs I have to replace on the exhaust manifold. The V-belt configuration of the 2.7 liter engine, it's a little bit confusing, but don't let the 3 belts basically overwhelm you. The basic technique is to loosen up all the belts and weasel them through the fan. If the belts aren't coming loose, you have to loosen up the mounting points for the alternator and or the power steering. You're going to have a lock bolt right here on the front usually, and then you're going to come in from the other side and loosen up the tensioning system. So this did start out as a head gasket, so basically put everything in order. So that way when it goes back together, it's not super difficult. Now this does turn into a complete piston job, so let's carry on. Toyota wants you to use some kind of specialty tool to hold the fan in place when you're loosening up the nuts that hold it into place. But if you use a breaker bar on the nuts, it comes loose pretty easy. Preparing the fan shroud to get removed, I did find a bunch of zip ties and brown stuff on the radiator shroud. So this is essentially the radiator stop seal that's inside of this engine. So if I would have known how gnarly that stuff was, I wouldn't have took this job on. The fan shroud is 4 10mm bolts. I definitely recommend going to Harbor Freight and getting an electric ratchet. So last time I did an engine job, these weren't the mainstream thing, but they are absolutely amazing. So if you take the fan up with the shroud together, you don't have to unbelt the little clip underneath the shroud that can be a little bit difficult to go back in when it's in the car. Place some cardboard on the radiator because trust me, we're going to have to be pulling things off the front of the engine and you don't want a hole inside of your radiator. We're going to move on to the crank bolt, which is an absolute challenge, especially if it's never been taken off. A 1/2-inch impact gun is not going to work. You're going to need some kind of specialty holding tool. So I got this cheapest one ever made off Amazon for $21. If you do decide to get this, let me show you how it works. Because I spent about 2 hours bending bolts and breaking stuff, because there's no instructions inside of the box. Knock the 2 of the front pulleys off of the main crank pulley, and then you're going to slide the bolts in after the 2 front pulleys are off. There's a little notch in the tool, and zap these in with a 13mm. Once the Amazon tool is locked into place, you are going to need 2 different 1/2-inch breaker bars. So I only had one, so it was Harbor Freight it is. I was honestly really impressed by the $18 Harbor Freight breaker bar. Totally recommend that. Once you got those 2 breaker bars in place, it's going to feel like it's torqued to about 800 foot-pounds, and this took me probably another hour to knock that bolt loose. Everyone has their own technique, but check out the tsunami technique. We start on the easiest and we move like water around the front of the engine over to the intake manifold. The intake manifold is definitely the hardest part of this job. It's not super difficult, but it does have a lot of wires, hoses, and fuel injectors, and you want that fuel to not be stinky. 27-year-old truck means 27-year-old plastic. There was no possible way I was going to unbolt the knock sensor without breaking the connector. Sometimes you get a little bit creative here, so I unbolted the knock sensor out of the block to weasel it through the exhaust manifold. When pressing down on these old connectors, you don't want to press on them too hard because they will break. And this can be a little bit expensive and challenging to replace connectors. So use a pick from the front. Unfortunately, the knock sensor, you can't get a pick in from the front. You're going to break at least one connector. Just try not to break every single connector on the entire engine. This is the fuel rail, and there's definitely gas in it. So a good idea to seal that up so no it's stinky. Removing the cylinder head can be a little bit intimidating because we do have to remove the timing chain. There's no amount of redundancy when it comes to dealing with timing chains. So remove the spark plug, get a long screwdriver, and pop it resting on the piston. This will essentially verify that you are at top dead center when you remove the timing chain. There's a website, it's called charm.com. It does have some basic free repair manuals if your car is up to 2014. So I was in charm.com and verified I'm at top dead center by looking at the crankshaft notch. So there's a bunch of notches on the crankshaft. Make sure you're on the top dead center one. First step, we're going to basically remove the timing chain tensioner. It's held in with two 12mm bolts, and I was pretty shocked because I had to pry bar this thing off. So it's definitely not been off for 27 years. At this point, we need to make a bunch of redundant marks on the timing chain gear and drive sprocket to make sure everything goes back together. So this does turn into a massive piston job, but at this point I thought it was just a head gasket. The old school Toyota engines had cam drive gears. On the exhaust side, you need to put a bolt inside of the quote-unquote service port. Sometimes you forget this and sometimes you need to remove this, so I will cover how to insert the bolt back into the engine. Toyota is absolutely amazing and makes their stuff friendly to work on. Both camshafts have wrench flats, so we got a crescent wrench holding the intake camshaft into place. The front of the engine has these little half moons that will knock free, typically pretty easy, but I just replaced the valve cover on this so they're freshly glued in. Once the half moon is replaced, you're going to grab and hold the camshaft into place. And then you're going to remove the front timing gear. This is an absolute challenge, so let me share you the technique that I got this thing loose in. Ideally, you would call your friend to hold the camshaft and you would knock this bolt loose. If you're alone, do this. Strong hand on the camshaft, weak hand breaking the bolt free. You don't want the engine to spin too much when you are knocking this free. Double check you're at top dead center by pulling the crankshaft back into position. When you're dealing with timing chains, you better have some bungee cords next to you, because when you remove the camshaft drive sprocket, this thing could fall down. So essentially you're going to zip tie everything together and use a lot of bungee cords. The camshafts have to come out of the truck to expose the cylinder head bolts. There is a special order to remove the camshaft bolt, so don't forget the front cap, because the first time I tried to loosen these, I forgot the front cap. So what happens is if you loosen these in the wrong order, the camshaft can twist and break. Now, camshafts are a very robust item and they probably won't break, but if that did happen to you, you would just go back to the center and suck it back down and start over. The intake camshaft is the identical procedure. Just start on the front cap and don't forget it. There is a little bit of a challenge when it comes to the front intake camshaft cap because there's two dowel pins. Once this is all loose, you may find this problem. The front cap is absolutely stuck into place. I tried a bunch of different techniques here, had to retighten everything, and this is how I got the front camshaft cap loose. Got a little bit of a 2x4 and hammered on the cam cap when all the camshafts were retightened. The cylinder head removal starts with two 12mm bolts going down into the timing chain cover. After that's removed, we can move on to the real cylinder head bolts. Do not make this mistake. Do not use a 3/8 ratchet when removing the cylinder head bolts. Essentially, you don't have enough force to crack these bolts loose. I guess you do, but you could actually strip the bolts out and that would absolutely suck. The two back cylinder head bolts are pretty wedged in the back, so make sure you have a whole stash of bungee cords to get that harness out of the way. In an attempt to basically save money, I got a 3-foot cheater bar on my 3/8 ratchet. Know when to stop because this was definitely going to break something. Back to Harbor Freight, aka Man Target, for the correct tools for the job. 12-point sockets are not a Toyota repair tool. Well, as far as the external part of the engine. Removing the cylinder head bolts, we start on the front and work our way towards the middle. Now it wants you to do this in several different stages as to not warp the cylinder head because it is basically a beer can of aluminum. Once all the cylinder head bolts are knocked loose, you can use some kind of impact gun, but don't forget here, there's a whole bunch of washers on the cylinder head bolts that like to stick to the head. Lift the cylinder head up and hold the bungee cord with the other hand. This seemed a little bit daunting, but in reality, it was very simple. Cylinder head is off the truck. It is vitally important to do a thorough inspection for cracks, warpage, anything else. We'll go into more details later, but the first thing that stood out to me on this truck was, what is this orange gunk? Essentially, this is radiator stop seal, and the only correction for this is to remove the block from the truck, remove the freeze plugs, and put it into an acid bath. So think twice about your $20 can of stop sealer.
Yeah, it's that radiator stop leak stuff. It's horrible. It does an okay job, but then all it does is coat the inside of the head, and then it doesn't really allow the heat to dissipate correctly. These heads last a long time before they need rebuilding, and by that time, they need a lot of work.
What's the full rebuild?
Full job on this is $650. You're gonna spend more money reconditioning this head and rebuilding the lower end with new parts to then just getting a used one.
And we also have vertical scoring inside of the block, so I was not expecting this during a head gasket job. So let's see what it takes to get that engine block out of the truck. If you're in your home garage, you're gonna need a lot of tools. So I like to go on Facebook Marketplace and find a used tool if I can first. Fortunately, I found this guy who rents engine hoist for about $100 and it fit inside of the Prius. While the truck is mostly disassembled with the wiring harness off and the cylinder head off, the remaining components, there's not too many of them, so I pulled the starter out, disconnected the slave cylinder, and moved on to those bell housing bolts. The transmission on the lawnmower 4Runner is the W58, and there's only 4 total bell housing bolts and a couple of dust covers. Removing the lower half of the engine, this one is a first for me, so I use the cylinder head bolts. You may not be supposed to do this, but there is nothing to bolt onto. It is pretty easy to point out your mistakes in hindsight, so these chains need to be substantially shorter because the 4Runner is a very tall truck. At this point, it seemed like it was going to be an easy task to pull the 300-pound short block out, but it definitely wasn't. So learn this mistake from me. Okay, I struggled with this for like over an hour. So the trick was to put a crazy tilt on here, and we just basically broke the engine block free. So without this tool, it would have been impossible, and I was just basically going back and forth, pry barring. I probably damaged this thing a little bit, but now the engine block is actually loose. Once the block is broken free from the transmission, you need to completely unbolt the motor mount. So I had another battle with these until I completely removed them down to the bare metal or cross member. The next step, I basically made another mistake. Do not forget to take the hood off the car before you start this job because the engine hoist will run into it. The long chains on the engine, basically the hoist would not go up tall enough to get over the radiator engine support, so I put some cardboard on it and I was able to weasel it out. Unless building engines is your full-time job, a lot of specialty tools are needed. So this is how I personally buy them. Facebook Marketplace used, look for rentals, Amazon, and then Harbor Freight. This engine is a manual transmission, so I have to remove the clutch, pressure plate, flywheel assembly before bolting it on the engine stand. The deeper I go into this Toyota 4Runner, the worse mechanic work I find. The engine dust cover right here was completely sheared off from the last mechanic. So things only get more exciting the deeper I get into this truck. A quick inspection of the clutch plate assembly reveals some serious damage on these springs. I have to figure out what is going on before basically moving forward. So after some investigation, I realized the clutch plate assembly was basically installed backwards. If you were installing a Toyota clutch, the sticky outside definitely faces the back of the car so it doesn't gouge into the flywheel bolts. The rear main seal assembly on Toyota engines is a bolt-in item that actually has some glue or RTV around the edge. This is a very high leak area of the engine, so I will cover in detail how to make sure this does not leak or cause problems. This is not a very simple task if you don't do this on the regular. So mounting the engine up to the engine stand, you're going to need some specialty bolts. Fortunately, Toyota uses 12 by 125, so it's a quick trip to Home Depot if you can identify the threads that go inside of the bell housing. I changed the oil in this Toyota 4Runner like 400 miles ago, and the oil coming out of it is pitch black. So if you were questioning the health of your engine, do a short interval oil change and basically look at the quality of the oil. It should definitely be amber or yellowish. After removing the oil pan, looking inside, we definitely have some bearing caviar. Not only bearing caviar, we have some serious plastic going inside of here. So what that tells me is basically the timing chain guides were completely cooked and falling off into the oil pan. With all the internal engine components laid out on a picnic table, it's time to do a thorough inspection. The 3RZ, the 2.7 liter Toyota engine, features balance shafts. So I'm kind of stunned by these things because they're not in many Toyota engines. Surprisingly, after 27 years, this timing chain is in pretty decent condition. The timing chain guides, on the other hand, are definitely a high wear item on these particular engines, as I will show you later. So what are you reusing after your 300,000 mile Toyota engine is laid out on the bench? Surprisingly, the crankshaft is in pretty decent condition. We don't have any spun bearings or heavy gouging into the crankshaft, so this can be polished or remedied later. The reason I pulled this engine out of the truck is the vertical scoring on cylinder number 2. If you run your fingernail against that, it definitely catches, and that is not a good thing. Inspecting cylinder number 1, this bald spot right here is normal. So basically it's called the thrust side of the engine, and when the piston's going up and down, it does have a little bit of a rocking motion and will wear out the cylinder wall right there. The overall condition of the cylinder block is in pretty decent condition. Moving on to the pistons, these are a wear item. Understand that piston rings will wear out. This engine had frozen compression rings, which explains why the compression was a little bit low. The very bottom piston ring, where I'm putting my screwdriver right now, is the oil control ring. Modern day Toyota engines still suffer from basically oil consumption because of the carbon deposits that build up in here. The amount of work that goes into disassembling an engine and preparing it for rebuild is an absolutely astronomical proposition. You can expect many hours of prep work, frustration, hammering, and inspecting everything for cracks and wear. The timing chain cover on the 2.7 liter is a very unique design. It has some nightmare Phillips head bolts into the timing oil pump, and basically you have to drill these out with a left-handed drill bit because they are not coming out with a Phillips head screwdriver. Without a professional parts washer, this process is incredibly time consuming, but it is 100% possible in your home garage with a lot of elbow grease. These circles inside of the engine block, they're called freeze plugs. So in case the water inside of the engine block froze, it would pop these out and not compromise the block. Toyota freeze plugs are notoriously a difficult job to do because there is like 25 different freeze plugs on a 4-cylinder engine. I popped the freeze plugs out of my motor and scrubbed it down thoroughly with degreaser, took it outside, pressure washed it, scrubbed it again, in an attempt to get the block sealer out of this engine. Unfortunately, I only made a little bit of progress. So think twice about your $20 can of Stop Seal.
You're gonna spend more money reconditioning this head and rebuilding the lower end with new parts than just getting a used one.
Remembering what Dan Cylinderhead told me earlier in the week, I'm going to spend more money reconditioning this 300,000 mile engine than just buying a used one. So I did call a machine shop, and they told me the only fix for the radiator stop seal is an acid dip. We need to bore over the cylinder bores 20 over to correct the vertical scoring. They want to deck the block, and my piston rings and bearings are going to cost about $300. A grand total of $1,100 in the bottom end alone. The cylinder head's going to need like $750 of repairs, so it's time to look for a used engine. The JDM 3RZ engine is $4,000. Now that is more than the truck is worth currently. So I went on Facebook and I found a used motor. Unfortunately, the 3RZ motor is kind of a rare bird, so I got this guy down to $800. Now the engine was in 2 pieces, which was a good and bad thing. First of all, I could inspect the cylinder bores, and they were in decent condition. But knowing Facebook Marketplace, you gotta do some serious due diligence. So at this point, I inspected the timing chains, and one of the guides was broken. So that is not the biggest deal ever. But I did decide to pull one piston out of the Facebook motor to see how the oil control rings were looking. The pistons are definitely in better condition than my 300,000 mile engine. The guy did claim it was a low mile engine, but once again we have frozen oil control rings. By installing this used short block, I would have had another problem of oil consumption. So that's why the internet doesn't like used engines. After pulling the pistons out of this truck, not only are the rings frozen, we have pretty smoked bearings for the claimed 100,000 mile used motor. Rebuilding an engine, they want you to take about 9,000 different measurements in about 9,000 different spots. So I do have a little bit of a shortcut for this later on in the video. But at this point, after spending 2 days disassembling and inspecting the old engine, I need to start the process over. Not only are the rod cap bearings smoked, so are the main cap bearings. Jumping into common failure points for the 2.7 liter engine. So this is the second engine with frozen control rings. Not to mention a broken timing chain guide. So those are definitely high wear areas on this engine, according to the last 2. There was some good news out of the Facebook motor. The machine shops are like 3 weeks to 3 months booked out to do any type of work. So I can immediately start rebuilding this used Facebook motor core. A Facebook motor is like a Tinder date, so you can't trust anything. So here's the plan for the used cylinder head. I'm going to replace the valve seals, lap the valves, do a valve adjustment, and replace the injector cup O-rings. Now most people will just immediately bring a cylinder head to a machine shop and let them deal with it. I'm trying to save the $650 from the machine shop's quote. The cylinder head refresh on this job was definitely the most difficult portion. And I also had to basically start over at this point and remove the camshafts. But fortunately, the second time you do something, the learning curve has basically adapted and this is not challenging. Removing the injector cups is pretty challenging, so the pry bar isn't the best technique because what this does is just basically break them. The technique to pull these out, I basically got a 10mm bolt, a large washer and a nut, and then pried on the bolt itself. The valve train components need to be well organized and well marked because they need to go back in the hole that they came from. Removing the valve springs, you're going to need some kind of specialty tool. So I bought the cheapest one on Amazon and it was a little bit frustrating. Once the valve spring is depressed, you stick a magnet in there and pull the keepers out. After a 2-hour battle of getting all the valve springs out, we're on to the next battle. Removing the valve seals. I would 100% buy the specialty tools for doing a cylinder head refresh if I ever did this again. The trick to get those valve seals out is to not use needle nose pliers. You need some kind of square tip, grab onto it and wiggle it around and it will eventually pull up. Underneath the valve spring is a washer that I kind of missed on the first round of removing the springs. Do not lose these washers because they're very important to make sure the spring doesn't gouge into the aluminum cylinder head. There is 2 schools of thought here. First guy would just immediately bring this to the machine shop and have it machined. If you're on the budget, here's my technique. We got a carbide scraper from Amazon that works like an absolute glove. Then we're gonna get a big old sanding block off Amazon with 120 grit paper, and we're gonna do nice, even sanding motions across the cylinder head to hopefully keep it straight. This definitely took quite a bit of time, but let me show you the before, and let's look at the after. The cheapest straight edge on the entire internet is $28, linked in the description. So the next step is to ensure the cylinder head is not warped 2/1000 of an inch. So you also need some feeler gauges. Another technique here is to shine light under the straight edge. 2/1000 of an inch is big enough that light will penetrate through it. But after you do the light check, you also want to do the feeler gauge technique. After a healthy dose of sanding this cylinder head, the 2/1000 feeler gauge still slides through right there. So it is very important to get the sandpaper out or bring this to the machine shop. After another healthy dose of evenly sanding this cylinder head, let's double check it. After rechecking like 20 different spots with the 2/1000 feeler gauge, it will not go through the straight edge any longer. So this thing is pretty straight. This isn't completely necessary on a low miles motor, but I wanted to try it because I've never lapped valves. Inside of the $27 Amazon kit, we do have this suction cup. And we got some valve grinding paste, and pay attention to how much paste I have on there. That is incorrect. After you develop the technique of actually getting that suction cup to stick to the valves, you just kind of spin it with your hand and you lift it up and it will re-spread the paste around. When the noise changes, you know it's time to lift up and spread the paste. The suction cup worked halfway decent on the intake valves, but when it came to the exhaust valves, they're a little bit smaller and it was super challenging. You have to like kind of dampen the suction cup, but not too wet. Essentially, don't use the suction cup idea. Once all the valves are lapped, remember, they go into a Pacific hole because they're essentially cut to that hole. After I lapped all the valves, I took it outside and pressure washed the cylinder head because I got valve grinding compound paste all over everything. After a healthy dose of compressed air and leaf blowing, let's look at before and after on the valve seats. The intake valve seats were in really good condition before I started. The exhaust valve seats, on the other hand, were pretty chewed up, so this was a good valve stem seals are two different colors sometimes. These are from an aftermarket company called Partsology. If you're doing a budget build, you're going to run across these guys. They were very responsive and told me that the larger opening is definitely for the exhaust, but I wasn't completely sure. From a quick inspection, the brown one does look like it is a little bit bigger, so I went ahead and installed the brown ones into the exhaust. Fortunately or unfortunately, I ended up damaging one of the valve seals, and then I ordered some OEM ones, and the gray ones were intake and the brown ones were exhaust. Here's the technique without the special tool. A heavy amount of assembly lube on the bottom of the valve stem seal. Use a 10mm socket on an extension and firmly push these into place. They don't require any hammering. That's actually how I broke it, was hammering on the valve stem seal. With all the valves laid out in a perfect order, we now need to basically compress the valve springs and put the keepers inside of the valves. This was a very long learning curve. If there was any specialty tool I would have bought during this entire process, it would have been an expensive valve spring depressor. This one on Amazon probably is better than the one I currently am using. After wrestling the cylinder head around the bench, I decided to put it on the high lift Daytona jacks, which does make your job a little bit easier. They actually make jack stands for cylinder heads, and that's a good idea to pick up. Whenever you get near the edge of the cylinder head, I had to take it off the jack stands and put it on the edge of the toolbox in order to compress the valves. After a monumentous learning curve installing cylinder number 1's valves, I lost some of the keepers and washers. It is so important to stay organized during this entire process. And I suggest doing all the intake valves and then doing all the exhaust valves one at a time. This is the technique to get the valve keepers into place that's so difficult. First step, we're going to get dielectric grease, and we're going to grease both sides of the keeper. Just a light coating of grease so it holds on the screwdriver and into place. When you are releasing the tool, you need to do this very slowly and guide the keeper into its spot. So it's not going to magically go into its hole. You have to kind of push it forward, push it back, push it left, push it right, and remove it slowly. I must have tried every technique under the entire sun. So you can't do this on the bench like this, but it does complicate things because basically the keeper wants to fall down itself. Things get substantially easier when the cylinder head is standing straight up. So I would 100% buy these cylinder head jack stands if I did another cylinder head.
You're gonna take this and you're gonna go right on the top of the valve. You're basically making sure it's seated. Okay? I like to work my way down the head. So you can do, again,
from one sufferfest to the next. So we're going to do the manual valve adjustment on the old school Toyota engine. And so this is pretty difficult, and I kind of have done this quite a few times. So you need to read the repair manual here or just take my word for it. So we have 7x1.0 threads on those camshaft caps. So that's a pretty small thread going into aluminum. So the repair manual says we need to put a light coating of oil on the threads not to gall up the aluminum cylinder head. Tightening the cam caps, basically start in the middle and work your way out, and make sure you use your ugga-dugga because they don't need to be torqued to spec because we're going to have to take those camshafts out about 10 different times. So if you're on the super budget, just type in your engine code and then end it with mark of shame. So this guy's basically uploaded the manual OEM Toyota manual. So thank you, mark of shame. So it's like 6 to 10 thousandths, so start out with like an 8 thousandths feeler gauge. So first thing we're going to do is make sure the camshaft lobe is boing, facing straight up. And then we're going to try to stuff our feeler gauge underneath. The intake camshaft valve clearance is usually in spec, unless it's a race car. So let's move into the real sufferfest, the overly tight exhaust valves. Before I could even get the camshaft installed, I found another used engine surprise. So the Vato Zone I bought this engine from stripped out an exhaust camshaft cap. So this is the precise reason you need to put oil on those threads. So Amazon to the rescue, it's a 7x1.0 bolt. Amazon has those readily available to repair BMWs. So this is how you do it. You basically over drill it to 8x1.0 with a special drill bit. Don't use any random drill bit. You have to buy the set off Amazon. And then you're going to push the Keeley coil in. So there was a little bit of a learning curve because you got to drill this thing pretty darn deep. We're going to need to roll the exhaust camshaft around in a circle. So we're going to remove the service bolt. So this is how you basically remove and install the service bolt. You're going to use a massive set of pliers and just push that gear up, and it's not particularly easy. It's easier to do in a vise. First step is to pull all the feeler gauges out of the tool holder, because this is going to be a little bit of a nightmare on the exhaust side because yours are going to be too tight. So we need this tool right here. You cannot use a dial caliper, you have to use this micrometer. I don't totally endorse what I'm doing right here, so basically I'm using a 27mm wrench to roll the exhaust camshaft so the lobes are pointing up. So later on in the video I'll show you what happens because I'm basically gouging up the cylinder head. In theory this is pretty simple, so we're going to roll the camshaft so the lobes are facing up. We're going to use two feeler gauges, a go and a no-go gauge, but the special tip here is basically take note. So on the go gauge, was it tight or is it loose? Because essentially the shims are measured in 10,000ths of an inch, so there can be some variation. So on the exhaust side, we are shooting for 13,000ths clearance because we are on a little bit looser side because these like to tighten up. So while you're measuring, make sure you're keeping track. So this is the precise reason the 3RZ, the 2.7 liter Toyota engine, is basically known to burn exhaust valves up. So on cylinder 1 we have a 5,000ths clearance, so that had about 10,000 miles before it burned an exhaust valve. So in theory, if you were smart, not a mechanic, you could build up this fancy spreadsheet like my friend did for me, but I still like to go back to my paper. It may seem like a lot of work, but this gets pretty expensive. So make sure you go through and measure the clearances 2 different times because the shims are pretty expensive. So after you've double checked all your clearances, it's time to remove the exhaust camshaft. So they do make this like fancy rabbit tool that you can pull the shims out, but I just find it easier to remove the camshaft. After the camshafts are removed, you can pry the shims out of the buckets, and then you need to measure every single shim that you want to change. So that is when the spreadsheet really did pay off. So what you're going to find is if these never been adjusted, it will have almost all the same shims straight across the engine. Inside of the repair manual there is this massive chart to help you select the correct shim, but it is basic addition and subtraction. So if your valve clearance is too tight, you're going to be using the minus number, and if it's too loose, you're going to use the plus number. So on cylinder number 1, it's ridiculously too tight at 5,000ths. With a shim installed of 0.112, we need to remove 0.008 or 8,000ths of an inch from this shim. So that would give us a new shim of 0.104. So now we need to convert this over to metric because the dealer only sells them in metric. So call them and ask them for a 2.65 shim. So you're going to run into this problem where they don't have all the shims in stock, so get it as close as you can, because you may get it wrong like I did even after all these calculations. So here's a massive tip here. These shims should cost you $15. I called 3 dealers, one was $30, one was $23, and then the honest dealer was $15. And they're also $15 on the yodashop.com. And I also would have ordered a whole bunch of extra shims because I had to go back to the dealership twice. The total cost of the valve adjustment so far is $140 to get this thing perfectly nailed. So remember, you're shooting for 13,000ths of an inch on the exhaust side, and I would not accept an 11,000ths, the minimum clearance. So on the 3RZ engine, it goes 10 to 14,000ths, and the 5EZ is a little bit looser. Maybe that's why the 5EZ doesn't burn up exhaust valves. Let's move on past that cylinder head. So the cylinder head was absolutely a challenge. So I do have some experience working on the bottom ends of engines, so it's hard to say whether the bottom end is harder or easier. So whenever you have larger parts, they're typically easier to work on, so I'm going to say the bottom end is easier. So we're going to prep up this cylinder block. So I'm installing this LC Engineering balance shaft delete kit because no good Toyota has ever had a balance shaft. So this will deviate from factory and it's a very controversial item. So let's get back to the OEM stuff. We gotta prep the living hell out of this cylinder block. So a good sealing engine has a lot of prep work going into it. So I don't know how I ever lived without this Amazon carbide scraper because it is absolutely amazing. So keep in mind this is a cast iron block, so it's pretty forgiving when it comes to cleaning. Scraping, wire brush, and just basically you're not going to hurt it like an aluminum bottom end. There's a couple absolutely critical steps on the rear main seal housing. So it's held in with FIPG, yes. But did you know? So this is a high leak area because it's FIPG, the rear main seal, and we have hollow flywheel bolts. Assuming you're going to keep your balance shafts in your engine, here's the failure points I've basically identified in 2 different engines in order of importance. So number 1, we should Loctite the studs into the block because I found them to be loose on both engines. These bearings are an absolute wear item and they're known to come loose. Mine weren't loose, but they were completely chewed up, so at this point it would be a good idea to pound in some new ones. The chain guides are gonna wear out on this engine because it's old school technology. All timing chains are wear items, regardless of what people say, they do stretch. Before we lived in a throwaway society, we could refurbish cylinder blocks. The newer Toyota engines use some kind of nickel plated coating on the cylinder walls so you cannot run a hone through them or overbore them. Because this is a 97 Toyota engine, a legendary cast iron block, we're gonna basically get this thing ready at home. So the first step before honing is we're going to clean out the cylinder walls super good with some Costco rags and degreaser. Full disclaimer, I am not an engine builder. So I watched a whole bunch of YouTube and you guys should really check out Tony if you're ever going to rebuild an engine at home. So the key points that Tony says is do not use a ball hone. You're going to order this one on Amazon. So this hone will basically show high and low spots and help you determine whether the cylinder is out of round. So Tony makes an excellent point. If you're building a grocery getter, a homemade motor, it's not a race motor and it doesn't need to be perfect. And he says you can be surprised by how well of a motor you can build at home. So we're going to use a whole bunch of penetrating oil on our tool and the cylinder wall to make sure everything is slippery. So remember, this is like sanding the cylinder walls, so we don't want to take too much layers off because this engine was in pretty good condition. So I want to make a very important point here. Right here on the edge, there will be a ridge. So if you say you were just putting a piston job inside of an engine, you would need to basically knock off that ridge. If you don't knock the ridge off, you will break the rings. So by honing the cylinder walls, I'm basically going to knock down the ridge. Stick the tool inside of there, make sure it's nice and oily. So you don't want to take too much layers off of this because basically you can make oil consumption problems. So I counted to 10 passes and basically let's inspect it. Before inspecting, actually, you need to basically coat the cylinder wall linings because this thing will flash rust in about 2 minutes. So make sure it's nice and oily so you don't get any rust coming up. Tony says if you use the ball hone, it will basically hide the high and low spots, so you could have a out of round cylinder wall that could cause some problems. So by using this hone, basically everything looks nice and straight, so I'm pretty confident in that surface. Now once again, this is a grocery getter and I'm not an engine builder, so it may not be the perfect surface. After carefully looking at the bores, the thrust side or the bald spot from the front of the video, if you remember, was not showing a perfect amount of cross hatching, so I'm going to go through this with 5 more passes on the hone. So that'll be 15 total passes. This is where things get a little bit intimidating. So I went to Harbor Freight and bought a whole bunch of micrometers. So the repair manual wants you to measure about 9,000 different things in about 9,000 different places. So I had to remember I used to be a dealership flat rate mechanic and we never measured anything. So I just basically threw this on a dial caliper and it's 3.745, which is not precise enough to measure pistons, but it's in the ballpark of an OEM non-overboard piston. So we're just going to send these pistons, but we can check some easy stuff like the ring end gap. So stuff the ring in there and square it up with a piston and check the clearance. So remember, when you take your car to the dealership, the mechanic gets paid by commission. So I used to just check cylinder 1 and then continue on and send it. While Tony will beat around the bush during his videos and say you should do all this stuff, in reality, if you're getting paid commission, these guys are hacking motors together like myself. So we're just basically going to raw dog this engine and hope for the best. Now this isn't the right way, but remember this is a grocery getter engine and it should be good. So now we got to take this outside and clean it. And I highly recommend not carrying a cylinder block by hand even with the crankshaft removed because I hurt my back. Now moving on to the cleaning the cylinder block, there's no exceptions for being super clean because basically things won't seal. So I got these Harbor Freight engine brushes and I'm going through all the passages with degreaser and blowing out all the grime and metal chips that I drilled and sanded earlier. You have about 30 total seconds before the bores start rusting, so make sure you coat these down with oil after you touch them with water. So if you use ATF, it works a lot better than penetrating oil. Once she's on the stand and oiled up, you need to have a little bit of a blowjob party. So I only have a small air compressor, so I start off with my Harbor Freight leaf blower and blow everything dry, and then I'm going to use the air compressor to blow out the small passages. Double, triple check everything is completely dry and there's no burrs. So we don't want any metal burrs, so I'm just running through the main bearing caps with some Scotch-Brite to make sure they're perfectly smooth. Here's the engine parts I decided on. Remember, this is an absolute budget build, so this is the D&J. D&J stands for domestic and Japanese, and it's a little bit clickbaity, their stuff, because they have American Eagle. So you think this is American stuff? Well, the price is incredibly cheap. So it's definitely made in China, and I have nothing wrong with that because this company allowed me to rebuild this engine for less than $2,000. Installing the main caps is pretty simple because these are large parts. This is not like a cylinder head, and these only go into one position because Toyota makes stuff super friendly to work on. There's a little notch and the bearing can only go in one way. Just make sure it's perfectly level, flat, and clean. This is the cheapest assembly lube on Amazon. It costs $11. So if you buy the Molly one, it was like $80, and this definitely wasn't in the budget. So I used way too much assembly lube. You just want a nice little thin layer, not just an absolute giant turd on the bearings, because this stuff makes an absolute mess. It's super important to be very well focused, in a good state of mind, and stay organized. So the main caps are pretty easy to put in because they are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the arrow facing towards the front. The main caps are pretty simple. We have a little bit of a notch, and the notch lines up with the notch on the cylinder block, so you can't basically put the bearing in the wrong spot if you're paying attention. But make sure these are nice and seated. When it comes to building an engine, it seems like wiping an ass. Like one guy's like, put oil in the back of the bearing. The other one's like, the engine will blow up. So basically, take your poison here. I didn't put any oil in the back of the bearing because that thing doesn't really move. So we're going to blow out all the main cap holes to make sure there's no water in there. One of them actually did have water. I almost forgot to put my Inspector Gadget suit on because we got to inspect the crankshaft for cracks and the surface of it. So I'm basically going to just put a little metal polish on this and rub it around with a rag and make it nice and smooth. This was not needed on a low miles donor engine. It is super important to stay very well organized, and let me show you why. So I was test fitting the crankshaft to make sure it would go in there and it would spin all nice and dandy, and I basically forgot to put the new thrust washers in this engine. So if you forget those thrust washers, these special shape bearings, you're going to have some serious problems. Thrust washers on the crankshaft side are pretty difficult. I had to pop them into place with a plastic tool, and then you need to make sure these are lined up. There is a notch and a point, so they basically lock each other into place. So this is the most difficult thing about installing the crankshaft main bearings, is getting the thrust washers in because they like to fall out. Let's talk about the stamps on the back of the engine block because I forgot to cover that. Or here we go. It's the main bearing codes from Toyota, so they're going to be stamped somewhere here on the back of the engine block. There will be 5 stamps because there's 5 main caps. These are the OEM bearing codes. So essentially, Toyota micro sizes the bearings for perfect oil clearances. If you buy the cheap aftermarket stuff, it's an average size of all the micro sizes. Because plastic gauging the main cap bearings is so inexpensive and not super time consuming, let's see how good those aftermarket D&J bearings are. Plastic gauge is super easy to use. You cut a little piece of wax off and set it on here on the crankshaft. So I actually made a mistake right here. You don't want to put assembly lube because it makes a big spready mess of your plastic gauge. So after a long process of torque stretching all the main cap bolts and putting a light layer of oil on the threads, let's see how good those D&J bearings are. The oil clearance on the main shaft journals was 25 thousandths to 38 thousandths of an inch, and they did vary from bearing to bearing and crankshaft journal to crankshaft journal, but they were all within the minimum to maximum specification per the Toyota repair manual. They were definitely a little bit on the looser side, but that can be a good thing because it can free up horsepower. When tightening the main caps, it took a little bit of a technique. So you're going to hand thread these in, run them down with an impact gun so they catch about 10 threads, and then you're going to hammer the main caps into place after they have a whole bunch of threads. Then go back through it with the impact gun and snug them straight up against the cap. So these are 12-point bolts, so remember, the first stage is essentially 29 foot-pounds with a torque wrench. And then after that stage, you're going to spin the motor around in a circle. And then the final torque is going to be 90 degrees. So I have this really expensive snap-on angle torque wrench that made life super easy. Once you've double, triple checked the crankshaft is in place, let's move on to the pistons. One of the most irritating parts about this job is picking out these clips that hold the wrist pin into place. So the technique is there's two openings and you're going to use a flat bladed screwdriver that hopefully has a warranty like a snap-on one because you might break it. The DIY method of removing the wrist pins is a 19mm socket and you just hammer that thing straight through. So make sure you use the right socket, just a little bit smaller than the wrist pin itself. So this isn't particularly fun. And the repair manual wants you to use some kind of heat to push these out. So fortunately, these are free floating pistons, so you can hammer them out. Check out this foolproof technique to not mix up the rod. So this is rod number 2. So I got my center punch and put 2 dimples on the rod and the cap to make sure this thing goes back in the exact same hole and orientation. The rods are also micro-spec'd, and there's a whole bunch of numbering and coding on those, but we're gonna reuse them. Installing the wrist pins, well, it's easy and it's very hard. So first step, we're going to slide the wrist pin in with a little bit of oil and it'll go right into the piston. You're like, yeah. But then you have to put the 2 clips on that turns into an absolute nightmare. So the clip holding the wrist pin has an opening and the piston has an opening as well. So make sure these 2 openings aren't lining up. So inside of the official repair manual, it shows those clips facing down, so that's where I put it. Snapping those clips into place is almost impossible. Use a flat bladed screwdriver and wedge it into place. When you do get the wrist pin clips into place, they won't be like perfectly in the hole. Don't be too paranoid because remember this is a grocery getter with some affordable parts. Now these clips were an absolute battle. So let me summarize how I got them into place. So you're going to put them, wedge the closed side into the top and hold it with your fingers. And then you're going to use a flat bladed screwdriver from the bottom and it's going to make a loud popping noise when it goes into place. After the wrist pin is in place, per the repair manual, basically you're just going to move the piston up and down and there should be 0 free play. So there's actually a bushing that rides on the wrist pin. My kit came with them, but I needed a press to put them in, so I just kind of sent it and reused them. So I like to redundant everything and I put a dot on the front of the engine, even though the D&J bearings actually have a dot on the front of the engine as well, and the OEM ones too. So now we're going to put the piston rings on. If you don't have a ring compressor expander tool, here's the Sketchfest way. We're going to get some oil and just walk those rings around the piston. So you're going to start on the bottom ring. I call this the zipper ring. And then there's 2 more piston rings that go on each side of the zipper ring. And then the front 2 top rings are the compression rings. You can't screw up the compression rings because they're basically different sizes. Just don't forget the compression rings have dots and those face up. If you got the crankshaft in, I think you got the rod caps as well. So now we're going to clean up. Guess what? We got to take the Inspector Gadget assembler suit on. We got to put our janitor suit back on. So we got to clean those cylinder bores absolutely thoroughly. So I like to get some brake cleaner and blue rags, and you're going to wipe this thing until the rag comes completely clean. So this is pretty expensive because of the shop tools, the brake cleaner, and the rags. Let's get those pistons ready to go in the block. So this is kind of an optional step. Give it a nice old oil bath. The problem is basically the ring gaps have moved, so you have to reset those once again. So I've put quite a few pistons in trucks, and definitely with the Harbor Freight tool, it was hard. But this $17 Amazon tool made life super easy. So essentially this tool just squeezes the piston rings tighter and makes their life easier. So remember, it's a $17 tool. So you see the little hoses on the rod? Make sure you use those if you're an amateur. So if you put the hoses on there, you can just basically send the piston in as hard as you can and not worry about damaging the crankshaft. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but it did to me. So on cylinder number 3, I'm trying to get the rod into its home position in the journal, and it will not go. So there's a whole bunch of float when it comes to the rings and the wrist pin. So you need to kind of guide it into place and take your time. Once again, on those rod caps, we have 12-point bolts, so that means we need to carefully torque them to the proper specification and do a 90-degree torque swing at the end. After you're done staring at your project car, it's time to get back to work. So first thing we're going to do is basically spin the motor over with all the pistons in there. You should have spun the motor over after every piston went in. And then you can loosen up all the rod caps and put some plastic gauge on there if you feel like it. So I am here to report the D&J bearings look like they were in specification. The rear main seal is encapsulated in this assembly here. So remember, this is a very high leak point of the engine. So it's held in with RTV. So you need to not use too much RTV. So here's a quick way to not use too much. You can use a brake gauge and you're going for about 3 millimeters of this stuff. Just think about it like a mobile O-ring. The old timing cover is completely prepped, but my Facebook donor motor timing cover looks like it's in better condition, so I'm actually going to use that one. Which means it needs to be completely prepped and the oil pump removed to replace the O-ring. So here's the technique to remove those Phillips head screws. First thing you're going to try is a impact gun with a Phillips head socket on it. If the screw comes out, good to go. If not, you had to drill it anyway. Moving on to the timing components, we have the D&J master kit for the 2RZ and the 3RZ. So this whole entire kit with 2 timing chains and guides and tensioner costs $118. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a mini review with these timing chain components. Which chain was which? So this one I'm shaking has no noise and it's the low mile Facebook motor. And the noisy one was the D&J chain. So let's put all 3 timing chains on the bench and see which one is which. So the first one is the D&J chain, and you can see it's the shortest right here. The middle one is the low mileage Facebook motor, and the one on the back is the 300K worn out engine timing chain. Is the D&J timing chain kit absolute piece of trash? I don't know, you get what you pay for. Those 2 tensioners is the only reason I bought it. The entire kit costs $118 and I couldn't even buy 1 tensioner from the dealership for that. Well, let's move on to those timing covers. So after I prepped the new Facebook motor, I found another surprise. Basically, the guy stripped out the bolts that go into the oil pan on the front. Be wary when you're buying a used motor. This is a very unique attribute of an old school Toyota engine. Basically, the timing cover is part of the block's deck. So you need to double check that the timing cover isn't sticking above the deck, because I have to use the old timing cover. So I got my $24 Amazon straight edge and everything looks like it's going to seal up pretty nice. Getting to this O-ring would be an absolute nightmare. So if you have that timing chain cover off, you better replace that O-ring. The D&J Master Kit basically comes with pistons and every seal for the motor. Well, not every seal, a bunch of random seals, and you're still going to have to go buy some. But fortunately, the D&J kit does come with some metal gaskets for the timing cover. So metal gaskets are pretty good. They usually last a really long time. The lower timing chain install is super simple when you don't have the balance shafts on this engine. The crank sensor reluctor wheel goes first, then the crank sprocket, then the tensioners. There's one simple mark on the bottom of the timing chain sprocket, and there's a color on the chain. Once the timing cover is on, you cannot see the marks for the timing chain, so the repair manual says to put a zip tie on here. So I made a big mistake here. You should put the sprocket on there and then zip tie it, because later on when the head's on there, it gets a little difficult. If you're an old school mechanic, you maybe worked on a 22RE. It's kind of the same structure, but this is completely new to me. So after the timing chain cover is on, we now put the oil pickup tube. So I use orange Loctite on almost every single bolt I put on. It's just an extra layer of security. I have cleaned this oil pan like 2 times and a pressure washer, and I still miss some old RTV. So that little bit of RTV you see right there would cause this oil pan to leak, which would mean I'd have to take the differential out of the car to remove the oil pan. So make sure you're super clean and double, triple checking everything. Before the oil pan goes on, do not forget the oil pickup tube. So I showed that first. Do not forget that. It would be a really good idea to have a nice little chart, flow chart of what you're supposed to do and what's next. Once again, we have some RTV, and it calls for a little bit of a thicker area on the driver's side. So one interesting note, in the D&J kit, it does come with a cork gasket. So if you are familiar, which one is better, RTV or a cork gasket? Installing the crankshaft, well, we can't verify that our timing chain is in the right orientation until the cylinder head's on. While my janitor hat was basically on, you want to do a whole bunch of prep work and clean work depending on if you're working on someone's car or it's your project car baby. So I'm cleaning up all these intake manifolds because I am swapping this to a 4-port head. It comes with an 8-port head. The 3RZ is a EGR motor, so I ran a can of brake cleaner through here to see what was in the lower intake manifold. So this is why EGR is bad for your engine. It's basically mud coming out of that lower intake manifold. Finally, we're getting to those cylinder heads. So first step, we're going to blow out all the cylinder head bolts to make sure there's no water, grease, or oil inside of there, because you could like crack the block when you're tightening down the head bolts. Run the head bolts through and make sure that all the threads are nice and clean. So one interesting note, Toyota head bolts are 11 by 125. So you're not going to have that tap if you do need to clean it up. But if you go on Amazon, all these random weird taps are available next day shipping. The cylinder head gasket that comes in the D&J kit is definitely a composite, which isn't the strongest. It might blow 5-10 years later. They do sell multi-layer steel gaskets for this engine, but it is the budget build. So don't forget the FIPG on the cracks of the timing cover. Once the cylinder head is basically sitting in place, you're going to run those bolts in with an impact gun right up against the cylinder head. And then you need to go find the repair manual because there's a certain torque sequence that's not a normal start in the middle and move your way out. And after you do the first torque, you got to do 90 degrees again because these are 12-point bolts. So if you notice my bungee cord on the engine hoist, the engine might stay up by itself, but I don't know. I forgot to film this, but putting the sprocket on the chain in the cylinder head is a little bit tricky. So I would do that before I put the cylinder head on. After the head is torqued down, basically we can stuff the timing chain tensioner in there. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's got a little clip, and then you're going to roll the engine backwards to release the tensioner. Install the crankshaft pulley and make sure all your timing marks are basically lined up on top dead center and all the marks on the camshaft sprocket are pointing up. This is an absolutely vital step, so basically we're going to turn the engine over at least 10 times in each direction to make sure no pistons are hitting valves. I ran into some serious problems coming up ahead. Essentially the engine stopped. It feels like a piston is hitting a valve. So I just stopped and I'm staring at it. So I lost an entire day of work, and I'll explain to you what happened and what I think really happened. Let's just exchange the word mechanic with detective. So whenever number 3 exhaust lobe was about to depress the valve, the engine would stop rotating. So I had to think back. I know the bottom end spins, so it's something in the cylinder head. So I pulled the cylinder head back off, and 10 or 12 hours later of diagnosing, I pulled number 3 valve spring out of the engine, and this is what I found. We got a broken keeper. So I don't recommend doing my friend's little trick of hammering on the valve stems.
The screwdriver, all you're doing is just making sure they're seated. You hear that clacking? That's not like...
It's also perfectly possible I installed the valve keeper wrong, but I did learn one lesson when I was rolling the camshaft back and forth with a 27mm with just the exhaust camshaft in there. I was chipping off part of the cylinder head, and here is the metal. Regardless of whose fault this is, you need to turn the camshaft from the front intake cam lobe so you don't chip off part of the cylinder head, and make sure you roll this over many times after adjusting the valves to ensure the engine will turn over. Project Forerunner is starting to feel like building the Statue of Liberty. It never ends. So while I'm waiting for those valve shims, essentially I'm like, let's prep the head and put those injector cups in. So you can't trust any O-rings from 20 years ago, and these things weren't too expensive at $17 on Amazon. Just don't forget, they have O-rings underneath the cups themselves. Once again, the tasks never end. So a 27-year-old truck with about 20 years of oil leaks and the engine's out, you better clean that engine bay really good. So I got a big giant can of degreaser and I'm coating everything except for the rotten wiring harness. It is always a gamble using a pressure washer on a car, especially a 20-year-old car. The chances of causing more damage than good are very high, but the oil leak severity on this truck just called for it. So I gathered the team up, myself, and pushed this 3,000-pound slow runner into the garage. 3 hours of pressure washing and 1 gallon of degreaser, it barely looks better underneath the engine bay. I gotta put a new throwout bearing in this and clean up more clutch material even though I pressure washed it for like 10 minutes. Now let's hope that input shaft doesn't leak after pressure washing it. This is the old crankshaft and it's got a skateboard bearing on the end. They call this the pilot bearing, so you want to pay attention to how deep that is. Most millennials like myself will never experience a clutch service because these are an endangered species. So basically you just take a socket and hammer the skateboard bearing into place, and hopefully you have a picture of the old one to make sure you don't set it too deep. So whenever you're hammering in bearings, you always go on the outside race or you're going to cause some problems. At this point, I don't have the valve shim. It's 2 in the morning. It's December 30th. I got to get this done by January 1st. So you got a couple steps here in order to prep the flywheel. We have to put the dust cover in there first. So it's 2 in the morning. It's a very bad idea to be working on your car because you're going to make some serious mistakes. The crankshaft bolts or the flywheel bolts that go into here are absolutely hollow. So it's like an open hallway crankshaft. So make sure you use a ton of Loctite on these. So this is the first time I'm ever going to use a torque wrench on flywheel bolts, and let me show you how it goes. At this point, you should just tug of the flywheel bolts on and not follow the repair manual unless you do this one critical step. So inside the repair manual, it basically says get a pry bar, put a bolt into the bell housing, and then pry bar to hold it. So this isn't a problem for the first part of the torque, which is 19 foot-pounds. The problem is they want you to stretch these bolts 90 degrees, which is some serious leverage on your torque wrench. At this point, the flywheel moved quite a bit, and I was like, I wonder if this thing skipped time. So the only way you're going to stretch these bolts properly is by putting the front crankshaft holder into place like this. It was a horrible idea to work at 2 in the morning and with the cylinder head off. So look at all this junk that basically was on the trash bag. I don't even know where it came from. At this point, it may have skipped time. And unfortunately on this engine, that means the oil pump needs to come off and the pickup tube and the timing cover. And let's see if it skipped time. Fortunately, the chains were pretty robust, but I will be sleeping better at night knowing that the timing chain marks are basically lined up. Next day, waiting at the Toyota dealership at 10:30 in the morning for the order to come in. We got the new valve shim and we got to get this done. It's December 31st, so New Year's is not going to be very fun. So one unfortunate thing of being a mechanic here, guys, you make a mistake, it's very expensive. I made 2 mistakes, had to take the cylinder head off, so that was a $40 head gasket, a $15 shim, a lot of F-bombs, and at least 14 hours of free labor. Losing some serious motivation for the camera work, I definitely lost a whole bunch of footage of the clutch install and putting the motor in the truck. So it was an absolute battle of the dowel pin. Basically, the flywheel wouldn't go together because the dowel pin was bent. Then I got the motor in the truck, and the dowel pins on the block would not link up to the transmission. So I've done probably 10 Toyota clutches, and every single one of them is a battle. So at some point, when the two are very close together, the transmission and motor, you just got to grab the bell housing bolts and slowly walk them together with the bolts. So every mechanic on earth will despise me, including my friend who's helping me on this, but he also could not get the motor and the transmission linked together. So this little gap right here is pretty dangerous, could cause some clutch damage, but if you go very slow when you're walking the bolts in and make sure they're very close when you're sucking it together, I've never had any problems. After the transmission and motor are linked up together, you got to move on to the next battle. You got to get the motor mounts into place. Because this thing has the 4-cylinder lawnmower engine, it's a pretty easy job, but you do have to basically push over a 300-pound motor to thread in the bolts. And trust my Facebook rental engine hoist that's basically puking hydraulic fluid. Motor mounts in, transmission's linked up, so the battle doesn't end here. This is a 27-year-old 4Runner and I have to replace every single coolant hose and repair a lot of the wiring harness. So at this point, I've essentially got it 70% bolted together, enough to basically crank the engine, and it is a no crank. So I basically We had to become an investigator again, and remembering when I was cleaning the motor on this guy, there were some loose wires near the fuse box that I cut off. So after pulling every single diagnostic tool out of my toolbox, figure out this thing had a kill switch underneath the fuse box that I just basically cut. Very messy wiring system. It was time to prime the engine. So when you prime the engine, basically you're going to turn it till the RPMs change, and then you know it has full oil pressure. Then you're going to put the fuse back in there and make this boom noise. That was a lot of smoke.
Hey, at least you know it's gonna run.
At least it fired. It gave me a little bit of motivation to bolt on the rest of the accessories. So once again, this isn't just basically putting parts back on the car. It's an absolute restoration of replacing every single coolant hose, repairing wires, cleaning ground wires, cleaning the radiator, putting the power steering back in the car, bolting everything back together, replacing rotten vacuum lines, replacing gaskets, repairing strip bolts, just absolutely hours and hours and hours. And I definitely did fail my timeline for January 1st. If you're rocking a 20-year-old car, check out this original fuel filter. So this is the inlet side for the fuel filter, and it's an absolutely muddy mess. That's supposed to be clear gasoline. So replace your fuel filter if you have a 20-year-old car. On to the fact it's a 20-year-old car. These are half of the coolant lines I had to replace. So pay attention to all these bendy hoses right here. They cost $20 per piece at the dealership. So it basically bankrupt me. But see this spring thing on your screen right there? This is a hose bending tool. It's a little bit labor intensive, but it is substantially cheaper than buying all the pre-bent hoses at the dealership. So you see these hoses here, these are vacuum lines. I actually got these silicone vacuum lines off Amazon. Silicone's really nice because you don't have to pre-bend it, and I was able to replace almost all the vacuum lines for $22. So moving on to these right angle metal fittings, they were absolutely rotten. So this would be another really expensive dealership fix. So I found this right angle heater hose kit on Amazon for $36 total. But I actually gave up at this point and just put loop lines on all the coolant lines because the heater control valve snapped off when I tried to put a hose clamp on it. Let's see if she starts. She's running, but she's shaking. So if you remember from the front of the video, I deleted the balance shafts, so this thing's going to be quite the shaker. Plugged in my scan tool to check all the data to make sure this thing was running okay. So the air meter is reading 5 grams a second or something. It's a 2.7 liter engine, so the mass airflow sensor is reading too high, so I pulled that out and I cleaned it. And when I put it back in the truck, it made it run worse. That's the reality of working on an old car. It won't idle now. Okay, so it used to not be able to go up this hill in third gear, so let's shift it to third. Barely. It's like a 4,000 pound truck with a 150 horsepower motor, so it definitely feels about 20% more powerful, but I should have just let the engine blow up and drive it for the next 50,000 miles or so. That's why Toyotas are so great, because they basically need to be rebuilt, but they still will kind of drive and work. Running through the totals, the used engine was $800, the piston ring gasket kit was $350, the timing chain kit $118, valve shims were $140. I converted this to a 4-port cylinder head, so I had to buy an intake manifold. That was $150, so roughly $1,500, but I didn't have to deal with any machine shops. The main reason I got the used engine is because the machine shops were like 3 months out. They're like a clutch system. They're basically going extinct. So the rebuilt block would have been about the same cost with the acid dip and the machine work, and it was a 300,000 mile engine with definitely just more wear on it. It is possible to rebuild your truck on a budget, but I do have to warn you, the Felt Pro gasket, the second one I put on, basically was leaking externally. But after about 20 miles of driving, it stopped leaking externally. I've never seen an external leak on a head gasket dripping down the block. I would definitely be using a higher quality head gasket like the MLS, the metal one from LC Engineering. But when it comes to the D&J pistons and rings, I'm pretty impressed so far. There is a ton of fine tuning to get this motor into shape. It doesn't even have the hood on it, but if you click this playlist on your screen, you can see the entire restoration of this 97 Toyota 4Runner.